The wheel didn't just crack, it streamed. And then the world tilted. The whole rear of the wagon dropped left with a lurch that snapped her teeth together and threw her sideways on the bench. And for one suspended, nauseating second, there was nothing beneath her but momentum. The wagon still moving, the dry creek bed rushing past below the broken axle end. Oak splinters spinning into the dust, like a hand had shattered a fist through the spokes from the inside. The horses felt it before she could correct it. Both drafts surged forward in their harnesses, the sudden imbalance hitting their shoulders as a push. And Alara felt the reins go dangerously slack as the leads followed them forward rather than pulling taut. She didn't think. She moved. Both hands locked the reins into crosses around her wrists, the full sailor's wrap, the one that cost skin if a horse bolted but saved a wagon if it didn't. And she threw her weight back against the bench with everything in her, planting her boot heels against the splashboard and pulling. The leather went rigid. The lead chains sang under tension. The horses' hindquarters dropped as the bit found their mouths and held. Whoa. Not a scream. Never a scream. A command. Low, hard-edged, final. The voice she kept in the place below panic, where only the necessary things lived. The horses stopped. The wagon settled into its broken angle with a long, wounded creak, like a sigh from something that understood it was not going any further on its own. She sat. The dust that had exploded up from the impact was still drifting in the evening air, slow and golden in the low western light. And the smell of it was in her nose and on her tongue. Dry creek stone and iron, and the particular smell of split green oak that is nothing like the smell of wood that has had time to prepare for breaking. Her wrists ached where the leather had bitten. Her jaw ached where her teeth had met. The sun was 3 fingers above, the ridgeline and falling. She unwound the reins, hand over hand, and climbed down. The wheel was worse than she'd hoped. 3 spokes had blown clean from the hub, not cracked, but gone. The iron ferrules stripped from their beds, the oak staves lying in the dust around the wheel like a broken crown. The rim itself had caught the worst of the impact, where it met the creek stone's edge, and it had bent at an angle that made rolling forward not difficult, but impossible. The way a door bent off its frame is not difficult to open, but simply is no longer a door. She crouched beside it, pressed 2 fingers to the split wood the way her father had taught her to press fingers to the earth to read what was beneath. Slow, deliberate, feeling rather than looking. The hub was intact. The axle cap had held. The damage was bad, and it was specific, and specific damage could be worked with if you kept your head. She kept her head. She was 29 years old, the sole proprietor of the only millinery shop between Harlan Creek and the town of Crestfall. And she had a delivery due by morning and 11 miles between her and the nearest smithy and the sun going down over Ridgemont Pass. And none of that changed the shape of the problem in front of her. And changing the shape of the problem in front of her was the only thing that would change any of the rest of it. So she stood up, rolled her sleeves past the elbow, and went to work. She went to the back of the wagon, moved aside 2 bolts of fabric, a crate of hat pins, and a box of dried provisions, and pulled out the spare spokes she kept there. 2 of them, both sound, and the iron wedge and the jack her late husband Thomas had insisted she carry. She dragged the jack under the axle with both hands, her sleeves already rolled past the elbow, and began to work. The problem was the rim. She could replace the spokes. She had done it before, once, with Thomas guiding her through it. But the rim bent the way. It needed a smithy's hammer and heat to reform it. And the nearest smithy was 11 miles back in Harlan Creek, which was 9 miles further away than Crestfall, which was where she was going, which was where her delivery was due by morning. She sat back on her heels in the dirt, and looked at the iron rim for a long time. The sun was going down. The pass was empty in both directions. She picked up the jack handle and decided she would figure it out. She heard him before she saw him. Hoofbeats. One horse, heavy, unhurried, coming down from the north along the upper trail that branched off the pass above the creek crossing. She didn't look up right away. She had learned long ago that looking up too quickly conveyed a kind of desperation she refused to broadcast to strangers on lonely roads. She kept her hands on the wheel. The hoofbeats slowed. Stopped. "That rim's bent," said a voice. Low, unhurried. The kind of voice that had spent so much time in silence that it had learned to mean every word it used. She looked up then. He was on a dark roan horse at the edge of the road above the creek bank. A big man, broad through the chest and shoulders, wearing an elk-hide coat that had seen a decade of hard use. His hat was wide-brimmed and dark, pushed back just enough that she could see his face. Strong jaw, a beard the color of cedar bark shot through with threads of early gray, and eyes that were neither cold nor warm in the first second she saw them. Simply watchful. The way animals in the deep wilderness are watchful. Not because they mean harm, but because they have lived long enough to know that the world sometimes does. He had a long rifle across his saddle. He was not pointing it at anything. "I know it's bent," she said. He nodded once, as though this answer satisfied him. He didn't move. He didn't offer more. He just sat there on the horse and looked at the wheel the way she had looked at it, the way you look at a problem when you're trying to see its real shape. "You've got good spokes," he said after a moment. "Iron's the trouble." "Yes? I've got a fire kit." She looked at him. He looked at the wheel. There was something in the steadiness of him, the complete absence of performance or posturing, that made her say what she said next, even though she had not intended to say it to anyone. "I have to be in Crestfall by morning." "Creek bed's flat," he said. "Good firestone down there. If the iron's not cracked through, just bent, I can get it back close enough to true." She studied him for a moment longer. He had the hands of a man who worked with them, scarred across the knuckles, the right one slightly larger than the left from years of grip work. He sat a horse the way men sat horses when they'd grown up on them, which is to say, he didn't sit it at all. He simply occupied the same space as the animal without effort or thought. She stood up from the dirt. "Alara Voss," she said. He swung down from the horse with the ease of a man half his apparent age. He was taller on the ground than he'd looked in the saddle, well over 6 feet, and all of it weight-bearing muscle that didn't announce itself the way young men's muscle did. "Callan Briggs," he said. He did not offer his hand, not because he was rude, she would later understand, but because he was reading the situation and she was already moving, already pointing him toward the wheel, already back in motion. And a man like Callan Briggs respected motion. He crouched beside the wheel, pulled off one glove, and ran his bare thumb along the inside of the bent rim. His thumb stopped at one point, pressed, moved on. "Not cracked," he said. "Bent clean. We can work it." And so they did. He built the fire the way a man builds a fire when he's done it 10,000 times. No wasted motion, no ceremony, just efficiency and knowledge acting. Together. 3 stones from the creek bed formed a base, and he fed the fire with dry ironwood he pulled from his saddlebag in a tight bundle he'd clearly carried for exactly this purpose. And within 8 minutes, the flames were hot and focused at the center, the kind of heat that goes white gold at the core. He used tongs he fashioned from 2 flat creek stones and a length of wire from his kit to hold the rim over the fire. And he turned it slowly, watching the color of the iron the way a baker watches bread. Reading it, feeling it, waiting for the right moment that only patience could reveal. Alara worked beside him without being asked. She removed the broken spokes herself, working the hub pins loose with the wedge. And she had the 2 replacement spokes fitted and seated by the time the rim was ready to reshape. She handed him the mallet when he reached for it. He looked at her briefly, just a flash of something across his face. Not surprise, exactly. More like recognition. "Hold the other side," he said. She did. She pressed both hands against the opposite curve of the rim and held the iron steady against the creek stone while he struck 3 blows, precise and powerful, each one finding the exact point of the bend and driving it back toward true. The iron rang in the cold evening air. The horses shifted in their harnesses. He checked the curve against his eye the way a carpenter checks a plank, then struck one more time, half strength, correcting the last degree of deviation. "That's close enough," he said. "How close?" 3 miles at a walk, no problem. 8 miles at a trot, probably fine. 11 at a run, I wouldn't. "I won't need to run," she said. "Crestfall is 8 miles. He nodded and handed her the mallet back, and they refitted the rim together, she holding it in place, he driving the hub pins home. And when it was done, she stepped back and looked at the wheel and felt the specific satisfaction of a problem solved by hands. She looked at him. He was already kicking dirt over the fire, methodical, thorough. "What do I owe you?" she asked. He shook his head once, didn't even look up. "Mr. Briggs." "Callan." "Callan, I don't take charity." He looked up at that. Those steady eyes found hers across the dying fire, and something in them shifted, not amusement exactly, but something adjacent to it. The ghost of a smile that lived mostly in the corners and not on the mouth. "Neither do I," he said. "I was riding to Crestfall anyway." She held his gaze for one more moment, then accepted the answer and began to reload the back of the wagon. He helped without asking, lifting the crate of provisions back into place with one arm while she repositioned the fabric bolts. And then he watered his horse from the creek while she settled the draft horses and checked their feet. By the time the last light left the sky, they were ready to move. "The road's better north of the crossing," he said, swinging into the saddle. "I'll ride ahead. There's a washed-out rut about 2 miles up that'll catch a weak wheel if you come at it straight." She climbed to the bench, gathered the reins. The stars were beginning to come out above the ridge, thick, bright, the way they only looked this far from any town. "Then I suppose I'll follow your lead," she said. He touched the brim of his hat and turned the roan north without a word. And she followed. They did not talk much on the road to Crestfall. This did not feel to Alara like silence born of awkwardness. It felt like silence between 2 people who had enough of their own interior to furnish the quiet with something worth living in. She had spent enough time in rooms full of meaningless conversation to recognize its opposite when she met it. He rode about 30 yards ahead, far enough that she could watch the road and the roan without straining, close enough that she could see when he slowed or angled wide around a hazard. He knew this road. He knew it the way she knew the inside of her own shop. Not by memorizing it, but by having been through it enough times that the knowing lived in the body, not the mind. She found herself watching him more than she intended to. There was a particular quality to the way he held himself on that horse. An uprightness that wasn't stiffness, a stillness that wasn't passivity. Like a man who was entirely at home in the world and had made no promises to pretend otherwise. She had not met many men like that. Most men in her experience were performing some version of themselves, performing competence or authority or charm or danger. Callan Briggs seemed to have set all of that down somewhere long ago and forgotten to pick it back up. She thought about Thomas. Thomas had been a good man. She wanted to be clear about that in her own mind, because it was possible to be a good man and still not be a full man. And Thomas had been good without being complete. He'd been gentle and kind and dependable, and he had never once raised his voice to her. And she had loved him in the way you love things that are reliable and warm. But there had always been in her a larger appetite for fierceness, for depth, for a kind of presence that filled a room the way a stone fireplace fills it rather than a lamp. Something that gave heat rather than just light. She folded those thoughts away neatly. This was a road. This was a stranger. This was a practical solution to a practical problem, and it would be finished in 8 miles. He slowed as they came over a rise, and she saw why. The washed-out rut he'd mentioned cut diagonally across the road, deep and steep-sided, exactly the kind of feature that would catch a weakened wheel at the worst angle. He turned the roan and waited, watching her approach, and she angled the wagon left and crossed the rut at its shallowest point, and the wheel held. She met his eyes as she passed him. "Good line," he said. It was not much. It was the smallest possible expression of approval. But she noticed it landed differently than most of the larger, louder compliments men had offered her over the years. She kept that observation at arm's length. They reached the outskirts of Crestfall at 9:15. The town was small, a main street of 10 buildings, a water tower, a livery, and the lights of a few late-burning windows. But it was warm-looking against the dark, and Ilara felt the familiar loosening in her shoulders that came from arriving somewhere you knew. She pulled the wagon around to the back of the Pemberton General, which received her deliveries, and climbed down and knocked on the rear door. Abel Pemberton, who was 72 and moved like he was made of creek water sediment, opened it after a long moment and squinted at her. "You're late," he said. "I'm here," she said, which was the response she always gave. He accepted the hat boxes and the bolts of fabric and the wrapped parcel of specialty pins without further comment, counted out her coin, and closed the door. She turned back to the road and found Callan still there. The roan hitched to the post outside the livery, and the man himself leaning against it with his arms crossed, not waiting with impatience, just waiting the way stones wait. Because there is nowhere else to be. "Thank you," she said. "For the rim. For the road." She moved to climb back to the bench. "Where do you go from here?" he asked. She paused, looked back at him. His face was half in shadow under the hat brim, but she could see that the question wasn't loaded with anything. It was just a question. "I have a room above my shop," she said. 3 miles back west on the Harlan Road." He nodded. "I know that road." She waited for him to say something else, and when he didn't, she said, "Good night, Callan Briggs," and climbed to the bench and turned the wagon west. She had driven perhaps a 1/4 mile before she heard, behind her at a comfortable distance, the unhurried sound of a roan horse on a dirt road. She did not look back, but she did not tell herself it meant nothing. The shop was called Voss Millinery, and it was the first building on the right as you came into the flat stretch of the Harlan Road, where 3 homesteads clustered around a shared well. It was a simple structure, whitewashed timber, wide front window. A door painted the particular shade of Prussian blue that Ilara had mixed herself using the last jar of Thomas's imported pigment. But it had the specific dignity of a place that was cared for with attention, if not abundance. She pulled the wagon around to the small barn at the back, unhitched the horses, fed them, checked their water, and covered the wagon with its canvas sheet. The whole process took 30 minutes, and she did it without a lamp. Moving by, familiarity and the cold half-moon that had come up over the eastern ridge. When she came back around to the front, she half expected the road to be empty. It was not. Callan Briggs sat on the roan at the edge of the Harlan road, not at her gate, not pressing toward the property, just there. Looking at the shop the way he had looked at the wheel. Reading it. She walked to the gate and looked at him. "You followed me home," she said. "I came the same direction as you," he said. "I didn't say Crestfall was my destination. You let me believe it was." He considered this honestly. "I let you draw your own conclusions. I didn't lie to you." She regarded him. In the moonlight, she could see more of his face now. The lines around his eyes were deep and carved by weather and time, not hardship alone, and his mouth had a quality she couldn't quite name. Not soft, but capable of softness. Like iron that has been heated and worked so many times, it has learned to move when moved and hold when held. "What are you doing on the Harlan Road at night?" she asked. "Same thing I was doing on the pass at evening," he said. "Passing through." "Passing through to where?" A pause. "Wherever the morning sends me." She should have been unnerved. She knew the reasoning by which she should have been unnerved. A strange man, a dark road, a lonely property. She had all the components of a situation her better judgment was supposed to flag. But her better judgment had been operating in this territory for 4 years, and it had learned the difference between a threat and a man who simply had no comfortable place to land. "There's a lean-to on the south side of the barn," she said. "It's dry and there's hay. Your horse can use the paddock." He looked at her. "I'm not inviting you inside," she said clearly. "The lean-to is separate. I'm offering it the same way I'd offer it to any traveler who'd done me a service." "I understand that," he said. "Good. Thank you, Mrs. Voss." "Elara," she said, because he'd given her his first name on the road, and there was a logic to evening the count. Then she went inside. She woke before dawn, as she always did, and lit the stove and put the kettle on, and started the bread that she baked every third morning. And she did not allow herself to wonder whether he was still there until after the bread was in the oven and the coffee was made. He was still there. She could see the smoke from a small fire he'd built in the yard, careful, contained, just enough to take the edge off the morning cold. And the roan was moving in the paddock, unhurried and content. She poured 2 cups of coffee and carried them outside. He was sitting on an upturned crate beside the fire, cleaning his rifle, each piece laid out on a square of oilcloth in an order that spoke to a practice long established. He looked up when she came out of the door and stood, immediately, automatically, the way men of a certain rearing stood when a woman entered a space, regardless of whether the space was a parlor or a dirt yard at 5 in the morning. She handed him the coffee. He took it. They sat, she on the old ladder-back chair she kept outside for exactly this kind of morning, he back on the crate. And they drank coffee, while the sky turned from black to the particular purple-gray that comes just before the sun commits to rising. "How long have you run the shop alone?" he asked. 3 years, she said. "Thomas died in the winter of '82. Kicked by a horse, nothing dramatic." "That's plenty dramatic," he said. She considered that. "I suppose. I mean, there was no story to it. No meaning. Just a horse and a bad moment. Most things that take people are like that." "Yes." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "He was a good man. But..." She looked at him sharply. He was looking at the fire. I didn't say but, she said. You didn't need to. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, which was itself a small surprise. She had found, in her years of widowhood, that most people couldn't tolerate silence around grief. They always needed to fill it, with consolation or inquiry or redirection. Callan just let it be what it was. What about you? She asked. What about me? Any of that. Wife, family, home. He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, just gathering the answer from somewhere real rather than somewhere convenient. Had a wife, he said. 15 years ago. She went back east. Said the mountains were taking me somewhere she couldn't follow. A beat. She wasn't wrong. Children? No. Another pause. That was its own grief. She nodded. The sun came over the ridge. The bread had 12 more minutes, and neither of them moved, and the fire burned down to coals, and the roan walked a slow circle in. The paddock and the world assembled itself around them with the unhurried patience of a world that has never once been in a hurry. She didn't ask him to stay. She also did not tell him to leave. This was, she would later recognize, the particular shape of the negotiation she'd been engaged in her whole adult life. The negotiation between wanting and caution, between appetite and propriety, between the woman she was in the open country of her own mind and the woman she was required to perform in a territory full of watchers. He stayed 3 days. He was not underfoot. This was the first important thing. He did not hover or seek conversation or import himself into the rhythms of her days. What he did was be useful. Quietly, observationally useful in the way of people who have learned to read what needs doing and simply do it without making a production of the doing. On the first morning, he mended the fence along the paddock's north side, which had been sagging for 2 months under the weight of accumulated winter damage. She watched from the shop window. Not because she was watching him, she told herself, but because the work was visible from the window and she happened to be looking. And what she saw was a man who worked with the same quality of attention he brought to everything else. Fully, precisely, without waste. On the second afternoon, she was at the work table in the back of the shop, blocking a new hat form, her hands deep in the hot, damp felt, pressing the material into the curve of the block, when she became aware that the side door of the shop had opened, and Callan was standing in the doorway holding, of all things, her water bucket. She looked at him. Trough was low, he said. Filled it from the well. Thought you might want the shop bucket refilled too. I could have done that. I know, he said, without any particular emphasis, and set the full bucket beside the door and turned to leave. Wait, she said. He stopped. She didn't know why she'd said it. She looked down at the hat block in her hands, at the felt taking its new shape under the pressure of her palms, and she said the first thing that was true. Have you ever been inside a millinery before? He turned back, looked around the shop with the same careful reading gaze he turned on everything. The shelves of hat forms in their gradations of size, the ribbons coiled on their spindles by color, burgundy through rose through cream through black, the blocks and stretchers and the small iron the size of a fist she used for setting seams, the display in the front window where she'd put her best piece this week, a deep-crowned felt hat in charcoal gray with a wide brim and a band of black grosgrain. No, he said. What do you think? He considered it honestly, the way he considered everything. It smells like a different world, he said. Steam and something floral and iron, like 3 different lives in one room. She looked at him. That's exactly what it is, she said. He leaned against the doorframe, not coming in, not leaving, just occupying the threshold the way he occupied most spaces, without urgency in either direction. "You make all of these yourself?" he asked. "Everything in this shop." "How long does one take?" "Depends on the hat." She turned the block in her hands. "This one, 4 hours for the blocking, another 2 for trimming and finishing. The ones in the window, 6 to 8 each." He looked at the window display again, at the charcoal hat specifically, the one she was most proud of this month. "It's good work," he said. Not effusive, not decorative praise. The same tone he'd use assessing a well-joined fence post, a craftsman's recognition of another craftsman's craft. Something in her chest did a thing she refused to acknowledge. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than she let show. He nodded once and pushed off the door frame and went back out into the yard. And she stood at the work table with her hands in the warm felt and listened to his footsteps on the dry ground and told herself, quite firmly, that a man who refilled water buckets and recognized good work when he saw it was simply a man of basic decency. She was not convincing. On the second day, a customer came to the shop. Mabel Hennessy, who was the most comprehensive gossip in a 30-mile radius, and made a great performance of looking out the window toward the lean-to and back at Alara with an expression designed to extract information. "I see you've got a man about," Mabel said. "I've got a traveler using the lean-to," Alara said, "as I would for any traveler who needed it." Said Mabel, in the universal register of a woman who believed precisely none of what she'd just been told. Alara wrapped Mabel's order, 2 bonnets, 1 green ribbon, and showed her to the door without further comment on the subject. That evening, she told Callan what Mabel had said. He received this information with the same equanimity with which he seemed to receive all information. "Do you care?" he asked. "Not especially," she said. "I've been the subject of Mabel's conclusions before and survived it." "Then it doesn't matter." "It does matter," she said, "in that I want to be clear with you about what this is and what it isn't." He set down the knife he'd been using to cut the dried venison he'd brought from his pack and looked at her. "All right. You're a traveler. I owe a debt. I'm repaying it with shelter. That's all." "That's what you said when you offered," he said. "I'm restating it. Because something is making you feel like you need to." She didn't answer that immediately. The lamp between them threw his shadow long and warm across the wall, and outside the window the wind had come up and was pressing, soft against the glass, and she was suddenly very aware of how quiet this house had been for 3 years before he arrived in it. "You're a passing-through man," she said, "by your own description." "I've been passing through for 12 years, he said, "since I came down from the high country." "Then why are you still here?" He looked at her, long, the way he looked at things that required reading. Then he looked back at his venison. "Because the wheel broke here and not somewhere else," he said. "And the road sent me north rather than south. And you make good coffee." He looked up again, and this time there was that ghost of a smile. Still mostly in the corners, still not traveling all the way to the mouth. "And I haven't been somewhere that felt like somewhere for a long time." She held his gaze. "Don't mistake a comfortable lean-to for a home," she said. "I know the difference," he said. "I built both. On the 3rd night, the storm came. It announced itself first as pressure. A change in the quality of the air, a stillness that was too complete to be peaceful. Alara felt it at supper time and went to the door and looked north and saw the sky there had taken on the particular yellow-green color that the mountains manufactured before they unleashed something serious. She went to the barn and double-checked the horse's water and the latching on the stall doors and the security of the canvas over the wagon. She was coming back around the side of the barn when she nearly walked straight into Callan, who was doing the same circuit from the opposite direction. They both stopped. Up close, in the fast-dimming evening light, she was aware of him differently than she had been at a distance. The size of him, the warmth that came off the elk-hide coat, the way he had stopped with the unhurried precision of a man who never collided with things because he was always paying attention to where things were. "Horses are settled," he said. "I know. I just checked." "I know you did. I'm telling you what I found when I checked after." She looked up at the sky. The yellow-green had deepened to the color of a bruise still forming. "It'll hit by midnight," she said. "Before," he said. She looked at him. "The pressure's already dropping," he said. "I've seen storms come off that ridge for 12 years. It'll hit by 10. It hit at 9:40. The rain came first in advance sheets, thick, cold, angled hard by the wind, and within minutes had graduated to something heavier and more purposeful. A pounding horizontal rain that drove against the south face of the shop with enough force to make the windows tremble in their frames. Then the thunder, rolling down from the high country like stones falling down a staircase, not the sharp crack of summer lightning, but the deep, rolling, chest-pressing thunder of a storm that had organized itself in the upper altitudes over hours and was now releasing everything at once. She was at the window, watching the paddock, when she heard a knock at the front door. She opened it. Callan was there, soaked through in the span of what must have been 30 seconds. His hat dark and heavy with rain, water running in channels along the grain of the elk hide, his boots already mud to the ankle. He had his saddle and kit under one arm and the rifle slung over the other. He'd moved fast to get the gear clear of the lean-to before the roof let go, and the picture of him standing in her doorway in the hard rain, unhurried even in this, even soaked to the bone, was one she would not easily lose. "Roof," she said. "She's not holding," he said. She stepped back from the door. He came inside. She told herself it was the practical thing. The lean-to roof had a known vulnerability at the north ridge. She'd been meaning to patch it for a season. And there was no alternative shelter on the property. And this was a man who had repaired her wheel and ridden 8 miles to make sure she reached her destination safely. She told herself all of that. She also told herself that the particular relief she felt when he stepped through her door was purely logistical. She was mostly convincing. She gave him the blanket from the chest at the foot of the stairs and pointed him toward the armchair by the fireplace and built the fire up, and did not say anything about the fact that the house that had been very quiet for 3 years was, for the second time in as many days, holding the sound of another person's breathing. He stripped the wet outer layer of his coat and hung it on the hook by the door, moving efficiently, systematically, the way he moved through every practical task, and settled into the armchair with the blanket across his shoulders. His boots steamed faintly by the hearth. His hair was wet and darker than usual, pushed back from his face and without the hat. And the coat he looked less like a figure from the open country and more like a man. Just a man, in a room, by a fire, which was in some ways more unsettling than the other version. She sat across from him in the wooden rocker, and they listened to the storm together. It was not a small storm. It was the kind of storm that makes a house feel like a held breath, the kind that rattles the stovepipe and drives water under the door gap and makes the lamp flame lean sideways in the draft. Outside, the thunder was no longer rolling but cracking, directly overhead now, each concussion close enough that she could feel it in her sternum. and the lightning came in white sheets that turned the window glass to a mirror for half a second at a time. In one of those flashes, she saw his face clearly, and he was looking at the fire. Not at the window, not at her. Looking at the fire with a particular quality of stillness that she had been trying to name for 3 days and had finally identified as the opposite of restlessness. Most people, in her experience, were restless at the root. They fidgeted against the present moment, always leaning toward the next thing. Harlan Briggs had no lean in him. He was, entirely and without apparent effort, here. "Tell me about the mountain," she said. He looked at her. "You said the mountains were taking you somewhere your wife couldn't follow," she said. "I want to know where that is." For a long moment she thought he would deflect. Men, in her experience, were skilled at changing the direction of personal questions the way rivers changed around boulders. Smoothly, naturally, without appearing to avoid anything. But Harlan Briggs did not deflect. "Up there," he said, nodding toward the north, toward the high country invisible behind the storm. "It's not like down here. Down here everything has edges, property lines, people's claims on what things mean. Up there it's just what's true, what's necessary, what lives and what doesn't." He was quiet for a moment. "I went up after Margaret left, thinking I'd come back down when it made sense. But the problem with up there is it changes what you want from down here. Makes most of it feel thin." "And now?" she asked. He looked at the fire. "Less thin than usual," he said. The storm cracked again overhead, so close this time that the lamp stuttered. And in the half-second of white light from the window, she caught his eyes, and he caught hers, and neither of them looked away when the room went amber again. "Is that frightening?" she asked. "To find something that doesn't feel thin after this long?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," he said, "and no." He turned the blanket edge between his fingers once, a small, uncharacteristic movement. The frightening part is not the finding. It's the staying, trusting that what's real at distance holds up. "Close." He paused. "Distance is easy. Distance asks nothing of you. And close? Close asks everything." The fire popped. Rain hammered the glass. Somewhere in the barn, one of the drafts made a low, complaining sound and was quiet again. "I think," Alara said carefully, "that you were telling me something. I told you I was going to tell you the truth. You were telling me something beyond the truth about the mountain." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes." She looked at him. He looked at the fire. And between them, the distance that remained was not large. 2 armchairs' width, a rug, the heat of a good fire. But it had a quality of significance, the way certain short distances do, and what crosses them cannot be uncrossed. "Not tonight," she said. He nodded immediately. No protest, no pressure, no wounded withdrawal. Just received. Understood. Filed away for the appropriate time. "Not tonight," he agreed. And in the armchair, across from her, Harlan Briggs let his eyes close. Not asleep, just resting. And he looked, in the firelight, less like a man passing through and more like a man who had finally stopped walking long enough to notice where his feet had brought him. Alara rocked slowly and let the storm be loud and the fire be warm and the distance between the 2 chairs be exactly what it was. Charged and patient and entirely, quietly alive. She did not sleep. She did not look away. He fixed the lean-to roof in the morning. She came outside to find him up there with boards he'd salvaged from the scrap pile behind the barn, working with a hammer and a can of nails she didn't know she had. and the specific precision of a man who builds things not just to be done, but to be right. He'd already reinforced the north ridge and was working now on the south-facing overhang, where the weight of the night's snow had pressed in a shallow concavity that would have caused trouble with the next storm. She watched him from the door for a while, coffee in hand, the morning bright and crystal cold the way mornings are after serious storms, the kind of light that makes everything look new. Then she went inside and made eggs. When he came in, stomping the mud from his boots at the threshold, he stopped at the sight of the plate on the table. Just for a moment. Just long enough for her to see what surprise looked like on a face that had learned to keep its reactions contained. A brief softening around the eyes, a fractional drop of the shoulders. He sat down. They ate. "You don't have to fix things to justify your presence here," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm saying it because I want you to understand that the invitation wasn't conditional on Elara." She stopped. "I fix things," he said, "because I'm a man who fixes things, not to pay a debt, not to perform." He looked at her steadily. "Same reason you drove that pass alone in the dark with a broken wheel rather than wait for someone else to solve it. Because that's who you are." She said nothing for a moment. "Fair," she said. They finished breakfast. "How much longer do you need to be in Crestfall?" she asked, and was immediately aware that this was not, in fact, what she'd intended to ask. What she'd intended to ask was closer to, "How much longer are you staying?" But that question had too much gravity in it, and this one could be passed off as logistical. He wasn't fooled. She could tell by the slight settling of his expression, but he answered the stated question. "I'm not in Crestfall," he said. "I'm here." "You said you were riding to Crestfall." "I said I was riding that direction." She looked at him. "Callan. Elara. You can't just—" She stopped, took a breath. "I am not a wagon wheel. I am not a fence post. I am not a lean-to roof. You cannot simply fix your way into my life by arriving at the right moment and being useful." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I know that." "Then what are you doing here? Actually, honestly?" He pushed the plate aside and folded his hands on the table and looked at them. And she had the sense that he was choosing between the easy answer and the true one, and choosing took a moment. "I've been passing through for 12 years, he said, "and in 12 years, I've never had trouble leaving anywhere." A pause. "I've been here 3 days, and I've found trouble." The room was very quiet. "That doesn't mean—" she began. "I know what it doesn't mean," he said. "I'm not making a claim on you. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just telling you the truth. Because I think you're a person who deserves that more than you deserve a comfortable lie." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the wheel on the road, about the fire in the creek bed, and the way he'd worked without performance, about the coffee in the yard at dawn, and the storm, and the armchair, and the particular quality of the silence he carried with him that felt less like emptiness and more like space. "I need to make a delivery to Pemberton on Friday," she said. "The pass will be clear by Thursday," he said. "I checked the drainage this morning. The north wheel is still weak." "I know. I'll respoke it tomorrow." She picked up his plate and her plate and carried them to the basin, and she stood with her back to him for a moment, looking out the small window above the basin at the paddock where his roan and her 2 drafts were standing in the clean morning light, like 3 statements of simple fact. "The room at the top of the stairs," she said, "has a proper bed. It's where Thomas's brother stayed when he visited. She did not turn around. "It's separate from my room," she said. "The door has a latch. The terms are what they are." She heard the sound of a chair being pushed back from a table, heard his boots on the floor, heard the door open, and for one arrested moment she thought he was leaving. But the sound was followed by the particular sound of a man retrieving his saddlebag from the porch where he'd left it the night before. Coming in, not going out. She turned around. He was standing in the door with the bag over his shoulder, and the light was behind him, and he looked settled. Not triumphant, not even particularly pleased with himself. Just settled, the way the roan looked in the paddock, like something that had been in transit for a long time and had arrived. "Thank you," he said. "Don't make me regret it," she said. He re-spoked the wheel. He cleared the storm debris from the road to the gate. He rebuilt the south-facing wall of the barn where a board had warped, and he did it without consultation or announcement. She simply looked up one afternoon, and it was done. He was, she discovered, not a man who needed to be watched while he worked. He was simply a man who worked. And gradually, carefully, in the small increments in which meaningful things are always built, she let him into the days. Not all of them. Not the private hours of the early morning when she sat at Thomas's desk and did the shop accounts and allowed herself to be sad and also grateful, and also something she could not yet name. Not the evenings when she sat with a lamp and sewed and thought her long thoughts about the life she was building and whether it was wide enough for what she wanted from it. But the in-between hours, the hours that are too full for one person and too empty for two, those hours she let him into. He was a better cook than she'd expected. She discovered this on the fourth evening when she came in from closing the shop to find that he had made a venison stew that smelled like something from a kitchen that actually knew what it was doing. "You can cook," she said, with an accusation in her voice that made him look at her with that ghost of a smile. "I can do a lot of things that surprised you," he said. "Name one more." He thought about it. "I read," he said. "Everyone reads. I mean, I read everything, anything I can get. 12 years in the high country, I traded pelts for books every season. Philosophy, natural science, history, poetry." He said this last one as though he expected to be found ridiculous for it. She stared at him. "You read poetry? Is that strange? For a man who communicates primarily in single syllables, yes. Most poetry is better than conversation," he said, more honest. She sat down at the table and watched him ladle the stew into bowls. "What kind?" she asked. "Whitman, mostly. Some Tennyson. I have a Keats that I've read cover to back so many times the spine is gone." He set a bowl in front of her. "You? What? Do you read?" She paused. "I used to read novels. Thomas didn't see the point, so I stopped." Something crossed his face. Not judgment. Something gentler than judgment and sharper. "That's a shame," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "It was." After dinner, he went to the saddlebag that now lived on the floor beside the armchair and pulled from it a thin book with a cover worn smooth as riverstone, and he held it out to her. She took it. Leaves of Grass. She looked at him. "Keep it," he said. "I know it well enough now I don't need to hold it." She held the book for a moment, then she looked up. "Callan." "What are you doing here?" Not the logistical answer, the real one. He was quiet then. "I told you the real one, 3 days ago." "Tell me again." He looked at her across the table, steadily, without armor or performance or the particular restlessness of a man who wants to be somewhere else. And he said, "I think you know what the mountains feel like from inside yourself. That kind of altitude, where things are clear and there's no performance required." He paused. "I've been looking for someone who lives up there, in that same altitude." Another pause. "I found her on a road at evening with a broken wheel and her sleeves rolled up and her hands in iron." The lamp burned quietly. The stew cooled. Alara Voss looked at the book in her hands and then at the man across the table, and she felt something open in her chest that had been closed for a very long time. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but the way a window opens in spring after a long winter, slowly, on its own weight. "You're staying for Friday's delivery," she said. "Yes. And after that?" "I'd like to stay for the one after that," he said. "If you'll let me." She was quiet for a moment. "One delivery at a time," she said. "That's all I'm asking," he said. Spring came to the Harlan Road in the particular way it comes to Montana. Not gently, not gradually, but all at once. Like a decision finally made after a long deliberation. One morning, the frost was on the window glass, and the next it was gone. And the ground that had been iron hard went to mud, and then to something softer and more hopeful. And the first green pushed up through the paddock in the thin, deliberate threads that grow in places where horses have not stood. He stayed for 6 deliveries, then 12. Then the spring became summer, and the summer became something neither of them named out loud, because naming things can sometimes make them smaller. And there was nothing small about what had assembled itself in the whitewashed house on the Harlan Road between a woman who had learned to live at altitude and a man who had spent 12 years looking for the elevation that matched his own. It was not easy. She should say that. This is not a story about ease. There were evenings when she felt the old pull of independence. The fierce, self-sufficient independence she had built over 4 years of solitude. And she pushed back against his presence in the house the way you push back against a wall to feel its solidity. And he held. He held without stiffening, without retaliation, without the wounded male dignity that made most men brittle under pressure. He simply absorbed it and remained. There were mornings when she saw him looking north, toward the high country, with an expression that had nothing to do with discontent and everything to do with the way a man looks at the part of himself that lives somewhere else. And she did not try to claim that part of him. She let it be what it was. "Go," she told him once, in late June. "Take the roan north for a week. You're starting to get that look." "What look?" "The look that means the mountains are calling and you're trying not to listen." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not going to be here when I get back." "I will absolutely be here when you get back," she said. "I will be here with both wheels intact and the accounts balanced and bread in the oven, and you will smell it from a mile out on the road, and you will know that here is something worth coming back to." He went. He was back in 9 days. She had bread in the oven. He stood in the kitchen door with trail dust still on him, and the particular cleanness around the eyes that men get from high elevation and solitude. And he looked at her, the way he always looked at her, fully, without reserve, reading her the way he read the fire and the wheel and the iron and the road. And what he found in her, evidently, was something that continued to hold against all the examinations he had subjected it to. "You didn't worry," he said. It was not an accusation, more like a wonder. "I worried," she said. "I just also trusted." He set his hat on the hook by the door. "That's the difference," he said. "What is?" between what this is and what I thought it could never be. He came into the kitchen. I thought, after Margaret, I thought I had broken whatever part of me could trust a stationary thing, a lasting thing. He stopped in front of her. But you're not a stationary thing. You're a person who drives a pass alone in the dark. You're a person who puts her hands in iron. He looked at her. You're not asking me to stop moving. You're asking me to choose where I come back to. Yes, she said. That I can do, he said. She looked at him. He was close enough that she could see the new lines the high country had put at the corners of his eyes that week, and the way his jaw had firmed through the beard, and the particular expression in the gray eyes that she had learned, over months, was not the ghost of a smile, but was in fact its own thing entirely. Warmer and more specific than a smile. The expression a person wears when they are exactly where they have chosen to be and understand the weight and the gift of the choosing. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw. He went very still. Not frozen, still. The way the mountains are still. Completely present and without alarm. You are the most unhurried man I have ever met, she said. I have learned, he said quietly, that the things worth having don't respond well to rushing. She looked at him for one more moment, measuring, reading, feeling the altitude of the thing between them, which was high and clear and required no performance and no diminishment. And then she closed the distance. And he was right about rushing. Neither of them rushed. They were married in November, on a clear, cold morning with the first snow still on the ridge and the light coming off it at an angle that turned everything gold. Mabel Hennessy was in attendance, and she cried, which she would have died before admitting had anything to do with the fact that she'd been wrong about the lean-to. She told anyone who would listen that she had known from the beginning, from that very first morning she'd seen the smoke from his fire in the yard, that this was a different thing from a traveler using a lean-to. No one believed her, but no one argued, because Mabel, in a sentimental state, was preferable to Mabel in a contradicted one. Abel Pemberton from the General gave away the bride, because he was the closest thing to a patriarch that Crestfall and the Harlan Road could produce. And he did it with the subdued formality of a man who treated all events, commercial and ceremonial alike, with the same grave reliability. He shook Callan's hand afterward for a very long time and said nothing. And Callan held the shake and said nothing back, and it was understood by everyone present that a great deal had been communicated. Callan wore his best coat. It was not the elk hide. Alara wore a hat she'd made herself, dark green felt, with a single dark feather angled at the brim. And she wore it with the particular authority of a woman who has made something beautiful from her own craft and needs no further ornament. She had worked on it for 2 weeks, which was twice as long as she normally gave a hat. And she had never once admitted to herself or to him why. He saw it when she came out of the house, and he went very still, the particular stillness. And he looked at her the way he had looked at her work through the shop doorway all those months ago. The craftsman's recognition. Except there was more in it now. There was the whole of the year between the broken wheel and this morning, and the fire in the creek bed, and the storm, and the bread, and the leaves of grass, and 9 days of trusting and being trusted, and the hand against his jaw, and the distance closed. He said simply, "Alara." She said, "Don't you dare make me cry before the ceremony." He smiled, the full smile, not the ghost of one. It had taken her 4 months to see it arrive all the way to the mouth. It was worth the wait. The road between the shop and Crestfall was clear of ruts, because Callan had gone over it in September with a team and a grading board, and a thoroughness that the road would remember for a decade. The wagon wheel, rebuilt, re-spoked, re-rimmed, with fresh ironwork on the hub, stood in the yard against the barn wall. They'd kept it because it was the thing that had stopped them in the same place at the same time. And stopping is sometimes the beginning of the best kind of going. He still went to the mountains. Every season once, high and cold and wordless, where things were clear and the air was thin enough to cut, and the distance from any human noise long enough to hear what was underneath it. He came back each time with the particular cleanness around the eyes and the quiet that preceded speech. And she had learned to love even that version of him, the one that belonged to the ridge and the cold and the deep country. Because loving a person completely meant loving the parts of them that had nothing to do with you. And every time, without fail, he came back. He came back to the smell of bread, to the Prussian blue door, to the woman with the dark braid who met him at the gate, not with relief, but with a steady, open-eyed recognition of a person who has chosen well and lives every day in the knowledge of that choosing. She never asked how it was up there. She waited for him to tell her what needed to be told and left the rest where it belonged, in the high country, in the clean air, in the part of him that the mountains had formed before she knew him. "You're back," she would say. "I'm back," he would say. And that was the whole of it, and it was enough. She kept reading. Leaves of Grass first, then everything else she could trade for or order or press on Abel Pemberton to stock. Whitman, Tennyson, the Keats she bought him a new copy of with the proceeds from a particularly good October. She read at the desk in the evenings, and sometimes she read aloud to him while he worked by the fire. His hands busy with some repair or other, always some repair. And his listening had a quality she could feel from across the room, full, unhurried, entirely present. "Read that one again," he would say sometimes. She would read it again. And there was, in the simple repetition of a thing worth repeating, in the lamp and the fire and the two chairs and the book and the man who wanted to hear it twice, a kind of life that she had not known to want before she found it. Because you cannot want the shape of a thing you have not yet seen. She had seen it now. She knew its shape. That was the thing about Callan Briggs. She would tell you if you asked. And most people eventually did. Because they could see something in the way he occupied the world around her that made them want to understand it. Something in the way he stood at the gate in the morning, or sat at the table in the evening, or looked up when she came through a door. Something steady, something chosen. What she would tell you is this. He was a man who had spent 12 years in the high country, learning the difference between what was essential and what was noise. He had come down from that country and found, on a road at evening, a woman with her sleeves rolled up and her hands in iron, and he had recognized in her the same kind of clarity, the same altitude, that the mountains had spent 12 years teaching him. He was never in a hurry, but he was never, not once, anywhere else. And she, who had driven that pass alone in the dark, who had put her hands in iron and her weight against the reins and her voice into the silence and said, "Whoa," like a word that meant the world will not end here. She had let him in, one delivery at a time, one morning at a time, one fire at a time, burning down to coals in a house on the Harlan road where the door was painted Prussian blue, and the bread was always in the oven, and the wheel that had broken on the pass was kept in the yard like a quiet monument to the particular mercy of roads that know exactly where to stop you. The wheel that breaks on the road is not a disaster. It is the road asking you to stop long enough to see what's beside you Sometimes what's beside you has been riding north for 12 years. Sometimes your hands are already in iron. Sometimes the fire burns hot enough to reform what's bent. And sometimes, if you're paying attention, the thing you were building toward was never the destination. It was the repair.